There are members of the local clergy, a few dignitaries from Amherst College, which is literally across the street from the Dickinson homestead. Emily's brother and sister, Austin and Lavinia. A few family, friends, and neighbors from Amherst, and from Boston, Colonel Thomas Wentworth Dickinson has come, and I'll say more about him later, to read a poem about immortality. Emily Bronte's poem, No Coward Soul Is Mine. Emily Bronte was one of Emily Dickinson's favorite poets. Okay, so that's the scene. Now, no one there that May afternoon knew that Emily Dickinson had written nearly 1,800 poems and over 13,000 letters. They knew that she wrote poetry, but they had no idea of the volume. No one knew that 4 years later, her first collection of poetry in 1890 would sell out more than 11 editions and printings upon the publication in the next decade. No one knew that a century plus later, more than 2,000 books will have been written about her and her poetry. No one knew that 150 years later, there will be more than 3,500 settings of her poems to music, many of them art songs, including the Suite of 12 by America's most distinguished composer, Aaron Coghill. No one knew that she would become one of America's greatest poets, perhaps the greatest. Her work taught to the elementary children, her work taught to high school students, and her work taught to college students, undergraduates and graduates. One of the few poets that can make all levels of education. No one knew that she would be compared to Shakespeare, an author she so admired, as she said to her sister-in-law Susan, "With the exception of Shakespeare, you have told me more of knowledge than anyone living." So Shakespeare was her sort of go-to, Shakespeare in love. No one knew any of that on that May 19th afternoon, as she lay in repose in a robe of white flannel, lined with white linen, in a casket lined with white linen, with white handles and garlands of violets at her neck, and one pink orchid, and her tiny hands clutching the spray of heliotropes. No one knew any of this when she was carried out the back door according to her own instructions. Emily Dickinson wrote the instructions for her funeral to be carried out the back door by 6 Irish pallbearers. The Irish pallbearers were workers who at one time or another had worked at the homestead, at the Dickinson homestead. So 2 professors from Amherst were also pallbearers, but she insisted that they stop at the back door and the 6 Irish worker pallbearers take over. No one knew that. And then carry her on a bier that was made specifically for her coffin, which was 5 feet 6 inches long. The undertaker had made measurements from 5'3", which was probably her height, to 5'6", to have a little room in there for blood. And carried her out the back door, she had insisted, through the backyard and through the meadowlands around her house, to the West Cemetery, which is less than a mile away, maybe a kilometer, less than a kilometer away. Always in sight of the house, she said, meaning her house, so that you could see the cemetery. And it was the family plot. Not all of her immediate family was buried, but it was always in sight of the homestead. So home is so important to her that even in death, she wants to be able to keep her eye on the homestead. So I have some slides I put together. I'll rush through some of those so that I won't take up too much. I'll try to rush through. See if I can get this. This is actually a fair copy. A fair copy meaning that she copied this poem probably to be distributed to a friend in a letter or something like that, in her own hand, where the theme for this year's maybe 66 Midwest was taken to make a prairie. It takes clover, okay, and one B, one clover at B, and reverie. I think reverie is the key here, key word in this poem. Like, the reverie alone will do if these are few. Okay? I said reverie is the key here because reverie suggests this state of dreamy meditation, of fanciful thinking and musing and so on. But it also has an older French, it also came from the meaning of delirium and madness, and to rage, meaning to rage in speech. And so that will come into play later on as her myth of Emily Dickinson sort of evolves over the century and a half. Dickinson was the early days. She was 55 years old when she died. The life expectancy of a woman in 1830 when she was born was 43 years and 44 years for a man. So she did pretty well in terms of 12 years longer than the expectations. Okay. Now, here's the Dickinson image that we all know that has lived with us for 94 years. And I say 94 years because it was not made public until 1931. Even though the books were published in the early 1890s, there were no illustrations of her, no photographs of her, no images of her. And people were sort of clamoring for images. Who is this woman that has come out of nowhere? Western Massachusetts was sort of like Western North Dakota. You know, where is this? They don't know what she looks like. I'll give you a couple of examples of things that happened as a result of this. Most people assume that she had black hair because it was the daguerreotype. Okay. This is the only authenticated photograph of Emily Dickinson, although there have been two since that have come to light. One recently, not long ago, maybe about 15 years ago, but it hasn't been authenticated. Okay, so there's still some questions, but this has been authenticated. Okay, it's her selfie, the only selfie that we have. Emily Dickinson, if she can take a selfie. This, you'll see that she's holding some flowers in her hand. Flowers obviously become so important. She's wearing a locket that still exists at the Jones Library, at the Amherst College Library, Frost Library in Amherst. You can go down and see it. You can't hold it. They don't have to hold these things. They let you put white gloves on and look at it. I said, well, don't give me white gloves and tell me I can't touch it. But, and this was taken when she was about 16 years old, 1836, about 1846, 47. Probably by an itinerant photographer who would come through town and he would send notices out like, you know, we'll be taking pictures at such and such a place. If you're interested, the whole family would go and they would set up a little backdrop. That table and that tablecloth, and that probably is a copy of the Bible there, is seen in a lot of the daguerreotypes from that period. So the assumption is, they thought that originally that this photograph was taken in when she was at Coghill, but it's not indicated that it was taken in Amherst. Okay. This is the daguerreotype in its original setting. Look at the size. It's 2.5, 3 by 3 inches. Like, I don't know, bar soap maybe, something like that. That's how tiny it is. It was taken out after they found it. It was taken out. It was sent up to the Rochester, to Coghill, and it was clean. And so the images that we get are probably the clean image. But this is the only authenticated one. Again, it's so tiny, and it's obviously folded in real time. And there she is. Okay. This is her description of herself to Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who was an editor and a writer at Atlantic, and he had asked her for an image of herself, and this is what she writes to him. I had no portrait now. I mean, this is a poem, right? this isn't a letter, but so many of her poems get pulled from letters. She would alternate between poetry and prose. It was really a really interesting, fascinating study. But my hair is bold like the chestnut burr, and my eyes like the sherry in the glass that the guest leaves. Wow. Amazing, huh? And that image there is actually a lot better. The clipping of her hair. This also is at the Jones Library. Or, I keep saying Jones. There is a Jones Library in Amherst. The Frost Library at Amherst College. And trust me, you can't get close to this. They won't let you get too close to this for understandable reasons. But she had this auburn hair. She doesn't have the black hair that you think. This is a portrait that was commissioned by the family of the 3 children. Emily is 10 years old, her older brother Austin, and her younger sister Lavinia. And you can tell from this portrait the true color of her hair. Okay, that gray color. Okay. She was approximately 5'2", 5'3" inches tall. Her weight, nobody ever tries to guess her weight. Probably a good thing to do. Yeah. She was often described as thin and frail and pale. Okay. But she was neat and very careful in her dress, and always had flowers about her, and pear in her pocket on her aprons that she wore around the house or around. She always had flowers. Her complexion was pale, and they described her as having a fawn-like neck. You can tell maybe in the previous image here, her eyes, she suffered from her eyes look a little wall-eyed, a little cross there. She suffered from asymmetrical pupils. So when you look at her, she wouldn't be looking straight at you. One eye would be floating, and you can see this in the vertically here too. Okay. Now, this is a famous rendition of Dickinson, and it's often referred to as the ruffles and curls image. Her family did not like the daguerreotype. They didn't like the way it portrayed her. They thought it portrayed her as with a hair pulled back tight and staring and glare. They said, this isn't Emily. It's too stern looking. So they commissioned a miniaturist from Boston to dig around with her photograph. And they did one with a sketch with lace around her shoulders and neck. And then they put that ruffle around her. And then they gave her curls, as if she had permanent frontals at a salon. So it's the ruffles and curls, okay? Again, this happened after her death. Her sister Lavinia commissioned, they called it a reimagined portrait of her. And fortunately, none of these ever made it to the public. They never shared these with the public. And what they did is they tried to soften her harshness, or what appeared to be her harshness, her stern look, to make her look more feminine, to make her look more like a poetess rather than a poet, which implies a kind of masculinity and so on. Okay? Later on, I'll mention this, or she will mention this, is that just as they did this to her portrait, her first editors did this to her poetry. They tried to shape it into a more conventional looking poem. They gave it titles. She never titled her work except for a couple pieces. They tried to correct her grammar. They tried to smooth her rhymes into exact rhymes, and she was all about the slant rhyme for us. She was all about even some non-rhyme. They tried to regularize the meter. They took out her dashes and punctuated her work according to the conventions of the time. So even in her death, not only did they try to bring her into convention, but her work too gets tinkered with. And they're trying to turn her into something that she wasn't. And I think that's important to remember when you think about it. 1971, the U.S. issued a postage stamp, commemorative stamp back when first class mail was 8 cents. Some of you probably remember that. And you see the image that they use as a reversal instead of the dark. They reverse that imagery and gave her that white dress, which I'll talk about later. Okay? Real quick, some of the other dramatic persona in the Dickinson story. Her parents, Emily Dickinson, and her mother, Emily Dickinson. Her brother, Austin, and her sister, Lavinia. Lavinia and Emily were about the same size, and in fact, later on, when they were making some of the white dresses, in the late 60s, when Dickinson started wearing white, they used Lavinia, the dressmakers used Lavinia's body as for the fitting, rather than Emily, because Emily wouldn't even go to the seamstress to have the dresses fit. So Lavinia was really. Susan Gilbert Dickinson was the Austin's eventual wife, married in 1856, and became probably Emily's closest confidant and friend, and some suggestions even perhaps love. Okay, there's a book called Open Me Carefully by Martha Nell Smith that makes an argument for the relationship between Sue. Emily absolutely loved Susan. They lived next door, 150 steps away, the path between the houses. It's called, and I'll go through that later. And then, this I mentioned before, Thomas Wentworth Dickinson, one of the shakers and movers of American literature at the time. He was kind of a contributing editor to The Atlantic. And in fact, it was his article that was called for new young poets to come forth in American literature, the sort of start of this new American literature. And it's the letter that Emily sent to him that started their correspondence. She wrote 70 letters to him, including about 30 poems to him. Early on, he didn't take a liking to Dickinson's work. He tried to force it into the conventions of the time, thought she would get more readership, there would be more interest in her work, and never really published. She published about 11 poems in her life, none of which had her name attached to them. Some are suggested that she gave permission, but most of them were not with her permission. Okay, but only 11 poems of the 1789 that we know of, 11 were published during her lifetime. Okay? Here's the letter, a copy of the letter, that she wrote back to Higginson after she read this letter. Mr. Higginson, are you too deeply concerned to see if my verse is alive? Well, her wit and the mind is so near itself it cannot see distinctly, and I have none to ask. Should you think it breathed? And have you the leisure to tell me, I shall feel quick gratitude. It is a common Dickinson metaphor technique that she uses, where she'll introduce something at the beginning of a poem, and then pick language or words that she will pick up later on, so that you have the, if my verse is alive, and then should you think it breathe, and so that idea of an infusion of life. So, but there's the actual 3-cent stamp, 6-cent stamp, I'm sorry. She included in this 4 poems, and she didn't sign her letter. Instead, she had a little envelope and her calling card, Ms. Emily Dickinson. When you read this letter, nothing signed here. And then later on, he looks in the envelope and there's this little calling card. Yeah. But that's the famous letter. people, and when she died in 1886, not quite double, about 4,600 people. Okay. Oops. Here's the homestead, 280 Main Street. So Main Street, obviously, there was a lot of traffic, and so she did see a lot of what was going on in Amherst because Main Street is one of the main streets. And isn't the work on Main Street? It's like 500 Main Street, so yeah. So this is the street view, looking at her house from standing on the curb. Oops. Thanks. And there's a sort of longer view. This is the restoration. The house was yellow like that during her time. One of the great things that the Dickinson people have done is great restoration process. You can go online to the Emily Dickinson Museum and follow the restoration of the house over the years. They've done a marvelous job. We were there once when they were doing wallpaper, and they were scraping, went up into her bedroom, and they had a section, and they had like about 8 or 9 layers of wallpaper that they were scraping through to try to get to the original wallpaper that would have been there at the time Dickinson was there. And they did find it, and they did restore it. They did a great job later on. They've done a remarkable job. This is her front door. Okay, if you went up across the street, went up to walk out the front door. The light in the window in the upper left is Emily Dickinson's bedroom. Okay, and that light will mean something here shortly. Reference it again. So it's her room. Again, looking down on Main Street. Here is the path between the houses I mentioned before. When Austin finished law school at Harvard, he had a job offer in Chicago, and he was about to head off, and his father didn't want him to go. The father controlled the family a great deal. He didn't want Austin to go, and he said, if you don't go and stay and open up a practice here, I'll buy you this Italianate house that lives next to that. Is 150 steps away from our house. And he took the deal. So he stayed and got married there and had children there and lived there until he died. So that's obviously an old antique photograph. It's about 100. We were there in winter once and we walked through there. The Evergreens wasn't open, but we got a tour from some people to get inside. And the last residents there, their last child died in the 1890s. They closed the door to his bedroom, and we were there probably in the 1990s, 100 years later, and nothing had changed in the bedroom. It was really spooky. Just as little Ned who died there, about 6 years old. And the house at the time was not restored, but it has been restored. It's a beautiful, beautiful restoration. This is a photograph of him. It's probably the only Italianate architecture in Amherst. And I don't know the history of it and why someone decided to build an Italianate house in Amherst, but there's probably a story that I should look up. Again, this is a kind of a self-portrait of her. I was the slightest in the house. I took the smallest room in the upstairs, the smallest bedroom. At night, my little lamp, a book, and one geranium. People talked about going down Main Street and seeing that light on late at night. They talked to her, people who lived in the house. Some of the servants talked about the light being on late in the night. That's when she did most of the writing at her little laptop here. This is a photograph of her bedroom with restored wallpaper. Okay. Unfortunately, all the furniture in the room, replications. where she would set, it was set in front of, she also would have geranium on the windowsill. What was her favorite red geranium? Smell, she would say, it smells
It's
like.
probably one of the cemetery rose.
Okay. Okay, and that's where she wrote a great deal of her poetry. Okay, again, that table is at Harvard. This is Emily's basket. She literally had it on a rope, and the children in the neighborhood loved her. She used to lower it down with gingerbread and cookies and some of her baking, her pastries and so on. And the kids would just get a kick out of it. And she hoisted it back up and so on. So she was in tune with what was happening outside, obviously. But it was sort of a quirky little image. And again, that Dickinson basket is at Harvard too. Anything that I'm showing you, all the originals are at Harvard. Okay. This is perhaps the most famous piece of furniture in American literature. This was the bureau that was in Emily Dickinson's room. About 3 weeks after she died, her sister was cleaning out her material, cleaning out her room, clothing and all that, and opened that drawer, that bottom drawer, the fourth drawer, and found, what I'll say were fascicles, and found these 40 books that had close to 800 of Dickinson's poems in it that nobody knew about. Again, they knew that she wrote poems because she used to send them to people in her correspondence and so on. But there were 800 poems tied in fascicles, and that's the bureau. Okay? Dickinson's travels. I'm going to switch gears here. In her life, I won't go through all of them, but this is basically the circumference of her life. The last 25 years, she never left Amherst. In her early 30s, she never left Amherst. And those last 15 years, she rarely left her house. But before that, she did leave town. She traveled to Boston for some treatment for eye problems and for some health problems with her sister, 93 miles away. South Hadley, Massachusetts is where Mount Holyoke Seminary was, where she attended for 1 year. And struggled there, not academically, but she was very bright. She missed home, she got sick, she had to go home for a month, so. And then to Springfield, Massachusetts, which was about 25 miles west of where Samuel Bowles, one of her correspondents, was editor of the newspaper. She took one major trip in her life with her sister. They went to Washington, D.C. to see their father for 3 weeks. He was actually elected as a member of Congress, and they went to visit him. So she traveled the 400 miles to Washington, stayed there. On the way back, they stopped in Philadelphia to stay with some cousins for 2 weeks, and that's it. So her circumference, I don't know what the equivalent would be from here to, well, Minneapolis is what, 240 miles, so maybe here to Chicago, that's 400 miles, maybe a little less. But she only did that once in a life. So up until the age of 30, that's the extent of her travel. Okay, and after that, she didn't travel. She was treated, she did stay in Boston for about, her second trip to Boston, she stayed there for about 7 months for treatment for her eye. She had some problems with shots. She was going blind, and she was treated by a physician, one of the top physicians in Boston. And she lived there for 7 months in a boarding house with her 2 cousins who were from Boston. But as I said, Dickinson never leaves Amherst for the last 25 years of her life. pretty adamant about that. Let's see. Okay, the second part that we want to talk about, Sheila talk about, is the idea of her nature, of her garden, and then something that she created, this herbarium that she created.
Right. Dickinson on nature and her garden, just 4 points on this one. At the time of her death, Dickinson was known locally as a gardener, not a writer, not a poet.
reconstruction. They are meticulous in the reconstruction of anything that they do with that place. They spend a lot of money doing it, and they bring in the best architects and the best archivists and so on when they do. There's a completed replication. Go back there, and then you can see there. Contemporary shot inside inside the conservatory. And then this is outside the door. The grounds are filled, lush with plants that existed and that were in Dickinson's garden at the time that she lived there and that she tended. This is a facsimile of her herbarium. Let's make sure I get this information right. She put together, she loved going out by herself and collecting cuttings, leaves. She would often put them in letters, press them in letters to friends, correspondents, and so on. This is the facsimile, that's the facsimile of the first page, and then here are a couple of pages inside from her original. Again, this is the hardware. Her herbarium was 66 pages long with about 450 specimens that she had included, identified with their proper Latin names, and so on. Botany was her favorite subject when she was in the equivalent of elementary school at Amherst Academy, and then when she went to Mount Holyoke Seminary, she also excelled in chemistry and botany. And obviously, she knew a lot of this stuff even before she got there. Okay? And they were so important that in 1890, when the first edition of her poetry was published, on the left, which is called Poems, they included the image of Indians, which was a common flower there on the sheet, which is her first serum was. Okay? And this is a later edition that maintained that Indian pipes. Okay? All right. The third topic that I want to just maybe touch upon here, we could go on forever with this, but is the imagination. That's another place that makes sense through Dickinson, her imagination, her mind. Okay? And that includes literature. She was well read. The 1,789 poems that we know of, that were extant. We know there were probably more that were destroyed after her death. And her letters. We have about 1,300 of her letters that mostly were written to people. She had 93 correspondents over the course of her life. And most scholars say that 1,300 letters represents about 1/10 of the letters that she wrote. So you do the math. That's 13,000 letters that she wrote in the course of her life. That's quite an amazing thing to think about, right? Some of you are not long letters, but they're letters and they're beautifully composed. And so she was working just constantly working. Okay?
It was a common practice to burn letters after a person's death. So unless a few more show up in somebody's attic.
Some little trunk someplace there. She published in a period, 1862 to 1865, about 3.5 year period. She published about 46, she wrote about 46% of the total poems that she wrote. 830 poems in about not even a 4-year period. 1862, she wrote 227 poems. 1863, 295 poems. 1864, only 88 poems. And in 1865, 229 poems. She was cranking out a poem a day, sometimes 2 a day. Like that. She was in this kind of white heat that she was working in. Reminds me of what we had going this last year when he was just couldn't stop painting, 400 paintings and sketches and so on. She couldn't stop writing. It was a very fruitful time for her. And there's some reasons for that later on. These are the fascicles that I mentioned were in the bottom drawer of her bureau at the time. You can get a sense of how she put those together, sometimes schematically, sometimes chronologically. Unfortunately, over the years, they have been mistreated in the sense that they have been pulled apart by various owners. And scholars have been good at putting them back together, but it can't be 100% sure that they were from her original. But she has to say, she's making chapels. Like we would create icons, right? Final project, like a chapel. She's making chapels. Folded, she would have a sewing needle that she would punch through, draw the thread through, and make it. And she's up there at night doing all this stuff. Everybody else is sleeping, and she's up there writing poems and making fascicles. This fascicle had 22 poems in it. And again, all of these are available in different places. They're not all in the same place. But the Frost Library has them at Amherst College and, of course, at Harvard. And there's an idea of what it might have looked like. And these are all in her hand. These are actually photographs of the fascicles. So she was a kind of an incessant writer of images and notes and so on. And one of the notes that has been found, it was found at the house, was this chocolate wrapper. Okay, and on the back of the chocolate wrapper was a line that may or may not have been incorporated into a poem at some point. But they always talked about she had her aprons that she wore around the house, and they would always be stuffed with scraps of paper. And so on. And that was, she had a little stubby pencil that she carried with her, and she was constantly stuffing holes in her pocket. Or not holes, but lines or ideas for poems. Okay? And this is one of her, what's called envelopes. Martha Warner is an amazing scholar, Dickinson scholar. Looked at us, went through some of the special collections and archives at Harvard and at Amherst, and found all of these envelopes that had writing on them, put them together and developed a, Dickinson referred to them as gorgeous nothings. And there's a book called Gorgeous Nothings. It's a beautiful book of poems that were taken from envelopes that she sent to different people or she received. Again, she's jotting them down. You can see what she does for a number of these. I'm going to go back and I think I said something here that I would be remiss if I didn't mention the white dress, which is probably what everybody knows about Dickinson. Okay. It's an article of clothing that was made for her. It's nothing special. It's kind of a wrap. We call it a wrapper in the 19th century that she would wear around the house. The one that I've not seen the original. I've only seen the one that was at the Dickinson Museum, and it's a replica. Let me read to you Jane Walt, who is the executive director of the Emily Dickinson Museum. She said, quoting her, "No one knows just when or why Dickinson began to wear white. Her inclination for doing so seems to have begun sometime in the late 1860s. Okay, late 1860s, she's 30 young, 31-ish, 32-ish. Okay, so she's not wearing white her whole life. She wears white probably the last 20, 24 years of her life, perhaps, but not her whole life. So, Jane Wall continues, she says, consider the parallel circumstances, the years between 1862 and 1865, the most prolific time for her as a working poet, with a rate of production of between 200 and 300 poems each of these years. It's also a time of great personal strain, the cause of which, again, we don't know much about recipient. She drafts intensely emotional letters to the master. These are 3 master letters. And I won't try to describe them to you. I won't try to describe them. I'll let you go look those up yourself because they're quick reads. And she also writes, Dickinson says that this was a time where she had a great terror in her life. We don't know if this meant that she was having trouble with her eyes and thought that she was losing sight, or that her relationship with Susan next door was breaking down because of some things that were happening in the family, and that included Austin's not so private affair with Mabel Loomis Thom, who was the wife of a young astronomer faculty member at the college. And people talk about seeing them riding around together in the coach and stuff like that. And she was aware of it, and she thinks that that strained the relationship between her and Susan. And she again rebuffed that invitation by Dickinson to go to Boston. She didn't want to leave. And then there's an event going on in the United States at that time called Civil War. And she was aware of it. She wrote about it obliquely. But she lived on Main Street, and the path to the railroad depot was on Main Street. They had to go by Dickinson's house. And when the young men from Amherst marched, she would hear the bands playing, the drums and the bugles, and saw them marching off from war. The great parade was on. Then she saw some of the caskets coming home. I think there were 38 Amherst young men that were killed in a town of, at the time, 4,000 people. And she knew the young men, and she knew the families. So there's a lot going on, and it's interesting reading. I won't try to do much more than that. Here's the family plot that she was finally laid to rest, that I read about, where she's coming back with the house in sight. Of course, now if you go there, you can't really see the houses. There are other buildings and the trees. It's not like it was in 1886. And here's a close-up of her grave. And her last written words were to her 2 nephews, to her niece and her nephew. She wrote them a note about a week before she died, and all she said was, "Called back." And that was it. Those were her last written words. Called Back happened to be the name of a very popular novel at the time. I don't think she was referring to the novel. I'm pretty sure she spent the last 2 years of her life pretty much sick with Bright's disease, kidney disease, which she died from probably. And she was in bed in the last months of her life, pretty much 24 hours a day. I have a photograph. Actually, that's not a photograph on the left. I have some copies of it. I'll leave here for you to take a copy. Sort of a reminder, a memory of where we're all headed at some point. Call back. This idea of this was a poet, what a poet does, distills amazing sense from ordinary meanings. Right? And that's the job, that's the duty of the poet. Right? And her poem, What is Paradise? Who live there? Are they farmers? Do they hoe? Do they not? Do they know that this is Amherst? And that I am coming too. Maybe Eden ain't so lonesome as New England used to be. So she felt lonesome there in New England. She said she thought New England. But Paradise and Eden, that was home. It was Amherst. It was the homestead. It was her garden. It was her imagination. It was her literature. It was her writing. Okay. So Amherst is reading to you, and the final thoughts, that I think are best captured by one of the earlier sort of Dickinson scholars, Susan Newhouse, who taught at the University of Colorado Boulder for a number of years. And I'm going to read to you what she says because I think it succinctly puts together what we've been maybe suggesting, what the way in which the shifting of our perception of Dickinson has been to this crazy, eccentric poet from New England, from Massachusetts, from Amherst, into something else. I'm going to quote her. She says, Emily Dickinson, a woman who wanted to be a poet, she made a claim earlier in her life that she wanted to be distinguished. It's a bit part of it was her ambition. Chose to withdraw from the external world and to live her most significant life in the world of her mind. The decision was surely what enabled her to be the poet that she became. It gave her control over her experience. Think about life for a woman in 19th century Massachusetts. What she could, and mostly what she couldn't do, and what the expectations were, and what Dickinson chose to do. She didn't marry, she didn't have children, okay? Didn't go to church, much to her father's. And it gave her control over her experience. She could select a portion, focus, examine, explore, satiate herself exactly as she wished and needed to do, such that her poetry could result. Dickinson, the mind was an actual place, as Sheila said, and I'm quoting Newhouse here. Dickinson's most important life took place not when she was baking the family bread. Her father would not eat anybody else's bread. And she had won second place at the county fair there for her bread making. She was a very good cook. And her father wouldn't eat anybody else's bread, but Emily's. Dickinson's most important life took place not when she was baking family bread, but she was adventuring dangerously and alone in the very deep and very wide terrain of her mind. Dickinson did not choose to be a normal 19th century woman. She did not choose to live where men live, in the public external world, or where women live in the domestic world. She found another place, at once more private and expansive than either of those others, the mind. To live in the mind, an actual and occupied place, was for Dickinson the key to solving the problem of how to be a poet, of how to achieve self-knowledge, the self-awareness, the self-fulfillment that being a poet demanded. She figured out how to use the imagination as a space in which to create some other life than that external situation. What Dickinson did was to make art from it. Suggest two essays. This essay by Susan Newhouse, and then there's an essay by Adrienne Rich called Vesuvius at Home. It kind of changed my thinking, my perception of my life somewhat when I read it many, many years ago. Adrienne Rich, Vesuvius at Home. And it's her meditation on Dickinson. And she kind of reimagines Dickinson in a way that I think makes lots of sense. So, I think we probably, I had my timer all ready to go and I forgot to hit it. We probably have gone over time, and we try to answer or respond to any questions that you might have. Or if you wanted to spend time looking around at the exhibit, which you should, it's a great exhibit, certainly do that. Or we can, if you want to talk to us individually, I can do that. I brought along some postcards, and then I have a yellow sheet that it's the professor. Gotta have handouts, right? I have some handouts here. This yellow handout put together just a kind of a quick list of editions of Dickinson's poems, editions of her letters, and biographies. There are a number of biographies of Dickinson and so on. And then a link to the Emily Dickinson Museum, where there's a world of information, links to other information. So, any questions or comments or observations? They don't have to be questions. I hope that we brought something new to you in terms of your perception and understanding of Dickinson, which I think is always helpful because we operate, when we deal with Dickinson, we always find out from our students. And again, our students carry Dickinson with them all through their education, all levels of their education. And it's nice that she's able to traverse all four of those levels. But they also carries, the myth of Amherst too. So, anyway, thank you for coming, and if you have any questions or observations or comments, certainly feel free to make them.
Well, she was an American curriculum, you have to hand it to her. And then, she's worth reading and reading about democracy. Or as she says in one of the letters to Boston, Minnesota, she says, "Into my garden, come." She's trying to draw them up. That's her place.
Any questions for our lecturers?
The 800 poems first found in the bureau.
Yes.
What about the other almost 1,000?
Those were retrieved from correspondence. Where I said that she, for example, it was very common for her to send copies of the same poem to maybe 5 or 6 different people at the same time. So they were able to retrieve some of those from some of the correspondence. Yeah, some of them. Yeah. Yeah.
So, and this might be outside the scope,
Well,
but I just read a criticism, like just today, of Emily Dickinson, that an author said she didn't have an ars poetica. And so, like, I feel like a lot of Emily Dickinson's poems are meta poems. But and the reason I asked that is one of the letters we, like, just quickly go through talks about, in my mind, Emily having an ars poetica. So I felt like she did write about how to be a poet. And so I don't know if you had thoughts about
yeah.
that. I'm new to sort of Emily Dickinson, and so much of her poetry is about the power of poetry, but it seems like she also has an approach to the art of poetry too.
Close observation, filtering it through what it taught her, several levels of knowledge, both intangible and intangible. She does frequently use an ars poetica, but she has this technique where in the letters in the poem, she's moving from one stage of consciousness into a totally different state of consciousness. Yeah, it's kind of an unconscious slide. It's called catalysis. And she was always writing about, how she was observing the world as observing the world.
She never wrote essays, nonfiction. She was never interviewed by an editor or someone from a journal or magazine. How do you create? How do you, what's a typical poem for you? Like that. She never wrote specifically about being a poet in the sense that here's how you do it, how to kind of thing.
Right.
So yeah, you're right in some way. She doesn't really have the art poetry. You can sort of see, she talked in one of the letters to Higginson, she says to him about, I don't know what poetry is, but, it blows the top off my head, I know that's poetry. Well, is that an ars poetica? I don't know, maybe it is. It's the closest maybe that she gets to it. But no, she doesn't. She didn't keep journals, so she doesn't have that sort of journal. I remember when I was doing some work with Steinbeck. When Steinbeck wrote The Crazy Graph, he wrote it in 100 days, but he also kept the journal alongside the novel. You know, so he's keeping a journal on what he did in the morning. You know, he wrote, and it's amazing. But you can get a sense of the compositional part. But you don't. There's nothing written in language that she wrote that talks about it.
Sure. Like it would be nice if you wrote a how-to manual, because that might help to direct some of her poems. But, and I'll stop now, but like it also feels like a gendered, maybe gendered is the wrong word, but like I feel like people want Emily Dickinson to be, and they did this after her life too, like some of her earlier revisions of her poem, they were trying to make Emily Dickinson into what they wanted her to be. Right. And so it's almost like another criticism that like wants Emily Dickinson to be like someone else, right? Like because a lot of poets, like even
Well, as one critic says, everybody has their Emily Dickinson.
yeah, and I'm reading my Emily Dickinson right now, by Susan Howe, which is wonderful.
Susan Howe's book.
But anyways, so yeah, I just think it's interesting.
Yeah, and that was, I think I was trying to allude to that earlier, where we were trying to force her into being more like a conventional late 19th century female poet.
Right.
And that's why she never published under her name, and she rejected the idea of publishing as the auction of the mind, she says. And so she was exactly afraid that would happen.
Right.
That critics would get it and do stuff as they did. You know, she was prophetic in that, in terms of her own work. That image that we have of her, the daguerreotype image, I don't know if we didn't get that image until 1931. So it hasn't lasted, nobody saw it until 1931. I mean, her family saw it,
Right.
but it was not a public image, so the daguerreotype is much younger in terms of our experience with it. Because for those reasons, the family didn't want people to think that she was what that image portrayed, whatever it is that it portrayed. Yeah, thanks for coming. Are there some goodies back there?
Yes, there are goodies, and I just wanted to point out a couple of things. She was so nice to mention Emily Dickinson version, like we actually do have a copy out here. It's available for purchase, and we can always order more copies if someone nabs it and you want another one. Also, this Natural Magic, Emily Dickinson, Charles Darwin, and the Dawn of Modern Science. There's some collected poems, a few of books of her collected poems. Unfortunately, your book did not get in here in time. It was back ordered, but we got copies on the way. So if you are eager to have a copy of the lecturer's book, I would happily take your email address and contact information, and we can get you a
I just
copy.
got a copy, they sent me a copy of, and it's a new printing, a new initiative that covers different and so on. So
Okay.
it still has a life, it was 2001.
Yes, yeah, it was back ordered from our distributor, so it's making its way
Still has a
slowly.
life. I think put the age in it. Thank you.
So yes, please, coffee, tea, cookies, have your fill.